Imagine your perfect clients coming to you on autopilot, already convinced that you're the authority in your space that they need. And imagine if you had a system that would automatically nurture your leads for you and get them to know, like, and trust you before even jumping on a call. So when you do jump on a call with them, they're already 90% of the way there. If you're like many business owners, you're tired of chasing down decision makers who ghost you. You're spending hours sifting through profiles on LinkedIn and sending hundreds of messages and getting no response. Maybe you've got a list of key decision makers that you'd love to get on a call with, but they just can't seem to spare even 15 minutes to speak to you. It's easy to assume that this is just part of the job, and with the right AI tool or the right message, you'll be able to start bringing in more of these ideal clients more quickly and getting on calls with them. But the reality is traditional outreach methods aren't really cutting through in the way that they used to. The competition is getting more fierce, and a lot of your competitors are going to be using the same kinds of strategies. And with all the AI generated content and AI tools available now, it's even harder to build real trust and connection with these people. But there is a better way, one that gets you in front of these key industry players, that helps you build authority, build real trust, and that only takes an hour or so of your time every week. And that is podcasting, more specifically the prospecting podcast, which will allow you to get in front of your ideal clients, build trust, and get on conversations with them with ease, as long as it's done the right way. I'm Joe, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to start attracting your ideal clients in just 90 days with the power of podcasting. So my job in this video isn't to convince you of anything. I'm not trying to prove anything. I just want to show you what's been working for our clients in the hope that you'll get some insight, and then you can take this and implement it into your own business. But first, let's talk about who this is for and who this is not for. So if you're looking for an overnight fix, a quick fix, podcasting isn't it. It's a long-term strategy that's going to build momentum over time with consistency. Even though we can start seeing results early on, the compounding effects start to build over time. And if you don't know exactly who you want to target, who your ideal client is, and who you really want to be getting on calls with, then this isn't ideal. Who this is for: if you know exactly who you want to target, you have high value clients that are going to make all this worthwhile. If you want to build authority in your space, if you're serious about building your personal brand and positioning yourself as an expert in your particular niche, then this is for you. And if you've got an hour or so to spend on this every week. So if this sounds like you, then keep watching. I want to make sure you come away from this video with a roadmap so that you can start implementing this yourself. So firstly, why podcasting? Why it's a viable strategy, and why it's only going to become more powerful over time. So currently there are over 500 million podcast listeners in the world, and this is increasing year on year. So podcast listeners, according to eMarketer, have increased globally 8% year on year. So podcast listenership is at an all-time high, and it's consistently growing. And it's not just being used as passive entertainment. Podcasting is being used to create real connections between the podcaster and their ideal clients. And in the last 10 years, the average time spent listening to podcasts has grown by 450%. So not only is podcasting remaining popular, it's growing, which shows that it's worth us putting in this effort up front so that we can get in early and start reaping these rewards while our competitors are still only using traditional forms of outreach. The other thing is the podcast listeners typically spend a long time listening to podcasts. So weekly podcast listeners on average listen for nearly 8 hours, and listeners build relationships with the podcast hosts over this long period of listening. So unlike short form content and, text posts on LinkedIn and things like that, podcasting is kind of like the end game where your audience can spend a lot longer with you, and you can really get in depth with them and build a stronger connection. Podcast episodes are also evergreen, so the content isn't disappearing as soon as somebody's seen it. With a podcast, you're building this platform that's going to stay relevant for a long time. And it's common to hear these days how nobody has an attention span, how it's all short form content, but it's just not true. Podcasts like Diary of a CEO are keeping leaders, business owners engaged for, 3 hours plus every week. And once you've positioned yourself as the go-to authority in this field, you can leverage podcasting to book calls with prospects. So offer them a podcast guest spot. So these decision makers who normally wouldn't want to get on a sales call or a clarity call with you, If you offer them a position on a podcast, it's a completely different ask. You're inviting them to a conversation on your podcast where they can spend 30 minutes to an hour showcasing their expertise, talking about their brand, talking about themselves. And as we know, talk to someone about themselves and they'll listen for hours, thanks to Dale Carnegie in How to Win Friends and Influence People. So you can start booking these calls from day one. You don't need an enormous following of thousands of people. You from day one, before you've even launched your podcast, when you're planning those first few episodes, you can start booking calls with your ideal clients straight away before anyone's even listened to a single episode of your podcast. And that's why we call this the prospecting podcast. So it's flipping outreach on its head. Instead of cold calling or sending hundreds of emails every day, you're giving them a platform. So it's a win-win situation. And it's a position that they want to be in and that it's a good PR marketing opportunity for them. And the length of the conversation as well. These podcast episodes are often 30 to 60 minutes. You can spend a lot more time going really in depth and building a real connection with these ideal clients, with these decision makers. You can build some real rapport in that time. And done right over time, just having your podcast out there and showing up for your ideal clients, producing content that you know that they'll enjoy, you're going to start to also attract ideal clients as listeners to the podcast over time. So this is an example of just one of the clients we've worked with, Selby Jennings. They recruit in finance and they released their podcast. This is just from their first episode, the post that they shared to announce that they were starting their podcast. It got a huge amount of interest straight away. And then even within the first handful of episodes, they're already getting on calls with their ideal clients, people who they probably wouldn't have been able to get anywhere near as easily on a call with them without the podcast. So we're going to now go through the 4-step framework of how you can actually put this into action, how this actually works, the 4 steps that you need to start a prospecting podcast for your business. There are a number of different approaches you can take with the podcast. There are solo podcasts and other ways of attracting your ideal clients through podcasting. This is just one of the ways that we're going to look at today, the prospecting podcast. So the first step is to define your goals and your ideal listener. Without these 2 things, it's going to be difficult to craft your podcast. But with these 2 things, it's going to make every decision you make going forward so much easier. So firstly, what are your goals for the podcast? Now, as we've established with the prospecting podcast, the main goal is to attract more of our ideal clients, get on calls with key decision makers in your niche. So creating new network opportunities is going to help you get on these 30 to 60 minute calls and build real rapport with these people. So it's, and then just digging down into what that goal means for you overall. So it's going to increase lead flow, which in turn is going to increase revenue for your business. Then the second question, who is your ideal listener and guest? So even though we're sort of focusing more on the guest side of things, we still really want to understand who is actually going to be listening to this podcast, because over time, as you attract listeners to the podcast who are going to be getting value out of listening to these conversations, that's going to help attract the guests you want to get on your podcast. And also it can help to turn those listeners into potential clients as well. So what role does your ideal listener have? So what position are they in? Are they an industry leader? Are they a C-suite executive in a company that you'd love to work with? And really get specific. You can even think about one specific person. Think about that avatar, that specific person that you want to be crafting your content around. What are their pain points, challenges, and desires? So what do these people struggle with every day? And I'm sure as part of your marketing, you've already had a think about these kinds of questions, but really thinking about it from a point of what are these specific challenges they want solving and what kind of content they would find valuable or engaging. So if it's just a case of they want to stay up to date with news in your industry, or they just want to hear other points of view and get inspiration, or maybe you want to attract candidates, in which case their pain points and challenges are going to be very different. Just make sure that you are clear on what those are, and then what action do you want them to take after. So just start thinking about this as well. After they've listened to an episode of your podcast, what would you like them to do? Is that to subscribe to your podcast so that they can stay connected and start building that connection with you over time? Or is it find you on LinkedIn, is it book a call with you? Just start having to think about that. The biggest thing that recruiters often overlook when building a podcast is that they don't pick a specific target audience. So everything we've said before is really essential to making this work. And I've worked with clients before, and I've spoken with podcasters before, and they try and target sometimes to too many different types of people. So they'll try and build their podcast around recruiters and also C-suite executives who are running recruitment agencies, and they're also targeting candidates. And if you try and target all these people at once with your podcast, then generally what's going to happen is none of them will be interested, because there are hundreds of other podcasts out there that they could choose that do speak to them specifically. So just make sure that you choose somebody who you want to target with your podcast and stick to it. Step 2, we're going to talk about creating and launching your podcast. So there's a lot to this. There's a lot of things that are often overlooked, but that are essential. It's not just a case of, opening your laptop, sticking on your webcam and calling someone up on Zoom and then just slapping it up on YouTube or whatever. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And we want to make sure that we're covering all these parts. So again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of technical jargon on this video. I just want to make sure that you're aware of all these important parts of the podcast to make sure that this works for you. So firstly, we're going to look at the details. So get a launch date in the diary. I suggest leaving a good couple of months to get this started. So 8 weeks or so, because you want to make sure that you've got everything in place. You want to get a few episodes recorded before you launch your podcast, and you want a little bit of time to build hype in your network around the podcast. So I'd get a date in the diary and make sure you stick to it. With these things, it's easy to keep pushing them back because other things come up. But with a date in the diary, it will help you to stay disciplined and just make sure that this does happen and that you can jump on this opportunity while it's still a huge opportunity. Now we want to think about naming the podcast. So we don't have to do this right now. You might decide, as you go through the other process of this, you might think of other name options that might come up that might work better. But you can at least start thinking about it now. So what could you call your podcast? One that's available. The name has to be available. There are so many podcasts on Spotify and iTunes and everywhere where they're using the same name as another podcast, and it's a surefire way of getting your podcast removed from the platforms, or just causing trouble, or just simply making it difficult for people to find your podcast because someone else's is going to come up. So if you think of a name for your podcast, you can then search through Spotify, iTunes, all these different podcast apps and make sure that it hasn't been taken. And while I can't offer legal advice, you might want to seek the trademark route when you do decide on a name. So a podcast name should be snappy, and it should be clear of what your podcast is all about. And again, just keep your ideal listener in mind. What's going to be clear to them that this is a podcast that's worth listening for them. So for example, if you're trying to attract candidates and you're talking about the hiring process, you're trying to get candidates to listen to your podcast and guest on your podcast, then you could use a name such as Hire Hiring, for example. So it's quite catchy, it rolls off the tongue, and it's easy to search for. Some things I would avoid when naming your podcast is using the word podcast at the end of it. So for example, the Hiring Podcast. One, because if it's on Spotify or iTunes, everyone's going to know it's a podcast anyway. Secondly, it makes it harder to find your podcast because it's not particularly unique, and the word podcast appears in so many other podcast names. So try and think of something clever, snappy, that's available, and that is also clear of what the podcast is about. And then next, we're talking about the format, the layout. So there are different layouts and formats for a podcast. You can have interview podcasts, solo podcasts, like quick 5-minute news podcasts. For the prospecting podcast, we are talking about these 30 to 60-minute interview episodes. The next step is to put together your visual branding. So if you already have a brand for your business, then that's going to help because you'll already have colors that you might want to use. I would avoid making your podcast look super corporate and linked to your brand. You want it to be more linked around you as a person, because this attracts listeners more than a very heavily branded podcast. So the main asset that you need to put together for your podcast is the cover art. And that's the square image that's going to show up there on the podcast apps when people scroll through. So your cover art. So these are a couple of examples, as you can see there. It just has the name of the podcast. It's using the colors of the brand. This one has a little picture of a house, so we know we've got that sort of visual representation. And also the text is just really clear. We don't have any extra text on there. When your ideal listeners are searching through and they see your cover art really small, you want to make sure they can read it. Then next up, we're talking about the audio side of things. So it's a podcast. So of course, the first thing you're going to need is a microphone. Now, I don't recommend using the microphone that's built into your webcam or your phone or your laptop, because even though this works, like it's going to pick up your audio, we really want to get a high quality, warm, intimate broadcast style sound for your voice recording. Because even though your listeners might not know it straight away, and your guests, when they listen to your podcast before saying yes to coming on as a guest, there's a psychological effect that high quality audio has on the listener. So for the microphone, I would recommend picking up something like an ATR 2100X. You can pick one of those up on Amazon for about £80, $100 or so, or a Shure MV7, which is a little bit more expensive, but you're going to be getting super high quality audio with that. Second is headphones, and then also putting together an intro and outro. And then the last thing is a trailer. Now, I see a lot of podcasts don't use this technique, but I highly recommend recording a trailer. So this is going to be around a minute long. You're going to record, it'll be like a more in-depth version of your intro. You can upload this to your podcast host, which we'll be touching on shortly. And anytime somebody finds your podcast on Spotify or iTunes or anywhere, they're going to see this trailer so they can quickly get an idea of who the podcast is for. The other considerations before you get started, before you launch, you need a quiet place to record. So if you have to record at home or in your office, that's fine, but just try and find a room where there isn't going to be any foot traffic or sort of background noise. Turn off any sort of fans or heaters if you can. And if you use one of these microphones that I suggested, they're specifically tuned to help cut out background noise as well, which is going to help, and just make sure that the microphone is positioned close to your mouth when you're recording. Editing is really important, that your podcast episodes get edited. So not just for cutting out the ums and ahs and pauses and mistakes that we all inevitably make when we're having a conversation with somebody, but it's also thinking about delivering as much value to your ideal listener as possible without wasting their time. So cutting out sort of tangents that aren't really relevant to them, and swapping things around. So if the start of the episode kind of went on a little bit too long and maybe got a little bit boring, maybe moving that to the end, things like that. Now, editing can take a long time, so you can find an editor to do this for you. And then your show notes. So each episode that you publish online on Spotify or your website or iTunes, there's going to be space below for a description of the episode. So thinking about how you're going to structure these show notes and putting together a template that you can use for each episode. And then it's time to launch. So the first thing to do is sign up to a podcast host. So a podcast host is basically like a hub where you can upload all of your podcast episodes to, and they're going to distribute it for you to all these platforms. So Spotify, Amazon Music, and so on. Secondly, after you've signed up for the podcast host, you're also going to have to go onto Apple Podcasts and sign in with your Apple ID. And then also, if you're doing a video podcast, then you're also going to want to sign up to YouTube and then make some noise about it. As you're launching a podcast, you want to at least be promoting it for a couple of weeks beforehand. So put your trailer out there before it's launched. Get people involved. Find some of your ideal listeners who you know are going to be interested in listening to this podcast, people within your network, so that you've got people ready, like a launch team, that on day one, they can go in, listen to your first episode, share it, leave a rating or review on their podcast app. And this is going to help you start building up that momentum from day one, make some noise and get more of your ideal clients interested in, joining and getting some airtime for themselves. The next thing to touch on is inviting your ideal guests. As we're talking about interview podcasts here, your guests are the heart of your content. So you want to be booking guests that are going to provide value, that are also your ideal clients that you just love to get out on a call with. So there are a few different ways you can attract these guests. They'll see the content, the trailer that you shared on LinkedIn, and hopefully reach out to you. Otherwise, you're going to be reaching out to your ideal guests and offering them a spot on your podcast. Or if they're podcast listeners themselves, they might find your podcast on the podcast apps and reach out to you asking to be on your show, which is the ideal scenario. But however they find you, all of these things that we've talked about, they're all part of the strategy. So making sure your podcast sounds awesome. But firstly, we're going to talk about identifying your ideal guest. So think about your ideal listener. What kind of guest would they want to hear from? The kind of people that are going to solve those pain points. And then those are also going to be people that you want to get on a call with. So create a dream guest list. So think about 20 ideal guests. So maybe they're key decision makers in a business that you'd love to work with. Get them on a list, and this will be something to work towards. You never know. A lot of them might say yes straight away, even before you've launched the podcast, for them to join you on your first few episodes. But either way, it's something to work towards. And then put together a mutually beneficial pitch. So again, this can be a great PR opportunity for them, especially if you can talk about who your audience is and why it would be beneficial for them to get in front of them. And then it's about inviting them, making it easy for them. So use a scheduling tool like Calendly, send them a link where they can just book a call easily. And then also provide them with a primer. So this is going to be a little document you can send over, a PDF that just goes over who their interviewer is going to be, what kind of questions they're going to be asked. Like, it's going to be a conversation. You don't know exactly where it's going to go, but at least giving them an inkling so that they can be prepared. And you can also add more technical things on there, like just make sure you're wearing headphones and make sure you're recording in a quiet room and so on, just to make sure that you can get the best out of them and they can get the most exposure as well. And then make sure you're using an easy to use recording platform like Zoom. A lot of your guests will already be familiar with using Zoom, so that's an easy one. Or if you want to get the best quality possible, use a more dedicated tool like Riverside.fm. It has a cost involved to it, but you can record in higher quality and you can record the video as well if you want to be posting these episodes on YouTube too. It doesn't stop once you've published your first episode though. You're going to be wanting to do this consistently, recording every week or every other week, whatever schedule you decide that it works for you. Just make sure that you stick to it. And then for each episode, you're just going to want to make sure you're making noise about it. So promoting each episode, so you can create shareable content. Like you can see this picture on the right here. He's posting it from his personal page, and we've created a short form clip from the episode. And this is going to help attract people to listen to the full podcast. Email campaigns. If you have an email list, you can leverage this as well. So if you've got a few hundred people or so on an email list, you can email out a link to your podcast and use those show notes that you've written to really entice them to listen. And then guest collaboration as well. So whoever your guest is, that can be one thing that you add onto the primer. So just saying that, if you to guest on this podcast would also require you, or would love for you to share this episode with your network as well. Because if you can get in front of their network, then that's going to be one of the biggest things you can do to promote your podcast. And tag them and engage. So you can tag the guest, you can tag anyone who you think could be interested in the episode, and just make sure that you're engaging with these people, talking to whoever it is who's listened to your podcast and finding out what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it, so that you can tweak your content and also drive that algorithm with the engagement. Measure and optimize. So the next step is to take a look at, again, who's listening to your podcast, how many people are listening to each episode. You can, whichever podcast host you choose, you're going to be able to see how many people are listening to the episode and how long they're listening for. And yeah, have conversations with them. Have conversations with your listeners, have conversations with your guests, find out what they liked about the episode, about the process, and you'll be able to tweak and optimize things over time for more exposure and to get access to more of those ideal guests. So at this point, you might be thinking, I don't have time for this. No one's going to come onto my podcast. No one wants to hear me talk or anything like that. But once you've done these things, once you've launched and once you've gotten the ball rolling, it starts to become a lot easier and it doesn't have to take you much time each week at all. And if you do this right, you stay consistent, you can start to attract more of your ideal clients in just 90 days. This isn't about creating content just because everyone else is. It's about building a platform that's going to position you as an authority and build real connections with your ideal clients. So now you have the roadmap. You've got everything you need to get started. If you'd like more help or you'd like more info on how this could work for your business specifically, click the link below this video and book a 20-minute call with me. And we'll work out whether the prospecting podcast is the right strategy for you and if we can help you to make it happen. Spots are limited, so if you're serious about using this strategy to attract high-value clients, then book a call with me today. And if you're not ready yet, then no worries. Download the guide I've linked below. It's a PDF that just summarizes basically everything that I've talked about in this video. And if you're not already connected, then connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm talking about this stuff every single day. I share a lot of content around these ideas so it can start getting you thinking about how you could apply this to your business. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching.